you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Our program here. Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's doing good. We have, I think, a nice program for you. Mr. Tom Waseleski, he's the one of the retired editors of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, is going to talk about one of the mill towns around Pittsburgh here. As you know, in the Industrial Revolution, when steel mills got going, most of these towns that grew up along the rivers were mill towns because the mill was there, the housing was right next to the mill, people could walk to work, et cetera, et cetera. Particular town that he's going to talk about is Homestead. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mr. Tom Waseleski.
Morning, everybody. Morning. Good to see you all. I understand that you had Len Barkowski here a couple weeks ago. He's a friend and colleague of mine from the Post-Gazette. And Len, of course, is a local historian, and he's written 3 books on Pittsburgh history. And I guess Len probably talked for about 45 minutes. I was invited to come here because I wrote a foreword for this book. And the foreword is only 6 pages long. So using that scale, I think maybe I'll talk for 2 minutes, and then we'll open it for questions. But I discovered this book, Homestead, The Households of a Mill Town, by accident. It was at a used book sale at the Sewickley Library, and this is the copy that I bought a few years ago. It has a worn and bland beige cover, a black and white photo on the front of a tenement alley in Homestead at the turn of the 20th century. And it was a printing from 1979. The title interested me. I paid $1 for it. But you know, it looks nothing like this beautiful new edition that has my foreword, full color cover. My name is above the title, which my mom really likes. Whenever she refers to this, she says, your book. I was reading your book last night. Mom, it's not my book. I mean, the author was Margaret Byington. I just wrote the foreword. You know, I didn't do much on that book. But anyway, back to the old printing. After I brought the book home, it sat on my shelf unread for at least a year. And imagine my surprise when I finally opened it and digested the first chapters. I realized they told the story of my family. Has anyone here done any genealogy work? Have you charted your family history? You look up records and things and find out the life course of your family. In every family, there seems to be that kind of person, that one crazy person who's eager to delve into the marriage licenses, the birth certificates, the death notices. that record the major dates in the lives of our families. In my family, I'm that person. And because I wanted to find out more about relatives I had never met or even seen, I was eager to have this book describe the kind of life that some of those family members lived. Although I knew my grandmother well, a woman who lived to the age of 98 and then died in 2005, I knew nothing about her parents or their lives in America. I was one of 5 grandchildren. All the other grandchildren were daughters, and my grandmother was the kind of sort of old school, old world woman who doted on the men. So my wife likes to say, in terms of grandma, the sun rose and set on Tom's head. Whatever Tommy wanted, you know, grandma was there to give it to him. So needless to say, I was close to her. When her husband, my grandfather, died, she moved in with our family, so we became even closer. And through my high school years and college years, grandma was a daily presence. And then when I moved away and got married, grandma was still there living with my mother until, as I say, at 98, she passed. But anyway, I didn't know much about her parents. When I finally opened this book, I found that it described the lives of people like Andras Monegas, my great-grandfather, his wife Anna, and their son John and daughter Annie, who grew up and became my grandmother. Andras had left Slovakia, Eastern Slovakia, at age 20 in 1898. His daughter Annie was born in Homestead in 1908. What drew me into the book was the fact that it was published only 2 years later in 1910. And the research that went into it was gathered in the years that my grandmother was born. So when this writer wrote this book and gathered all the stats in here, she was writing about the neighborhood where my family lived, the kind of work my great-grandfather did, and everything that those people had to live through and struggle through. When my great-grandfather died in Homestead in 1913, he was only 34 years old. He left behind no photos, no diary, not even a tombstone to mark his grave. The mileposts of his life are charted by only a handful of records: a ship's passenger manifest, a census report, a marriage docket, and a death certificate. For me, as the obsessive family historian, Andras has been an elusive ghost. But when I opened this book, I found his neighborhood, his workplace, his very way of life. You won't find his name in here, but he and thousands of other immigrant steelworkers live and breathe on these pages. So do their wives, children, and other relatives who came to Western Pennsylvania in one of the greatest waves of immigration in US history. Andras left his native village of Žalobin in eastern Slovakia, where people in the early 1900s led a simple life amid rolling pastures and green hills. The homestead he found next to Andrew Carnegie's smoky, grimy steel plant could not have been more different. Like so many Europeans of common stock, Andras came to America with no English and little education, but with a desire for a better life in a modern country. He and his fellow laborers worked long hours, lived in crowded tenements, and faced health risks unfamiliar to most Americans. Margaret Byington was the writer and sociologist who chronicled these conditions that the families faced, the sacrifices they made, and the price they paid to pursue their own American dream. She drew from a deep well of statistical research, but in the end, she did not produce a dry and boring academic account. Instead, her book bursts with insight, color, and humanity. I've walked the streets of the neighborhood next to the mill, wondering where Andy and his little girl, my grandmother, lived. The 1910 census says the family rented a house on West 3rd Avenue, but the old street is gone. It's been plowed under by the Homestead Mill's expansion long ago, then by its demolition in the 1980s, and ultimately by its replacement, the sprawling retail and residential development known as the waterfront. Maybe you've been there. Between Target, Barnes & Noble, and Yankee Candle, you won't find a hint of where the Monegas family lived, which is why Byington's book is more significant today than when it came out in 1910. It recreates a time and place that no longer exists. Byington concentrates not only on the mill work, but also family life, household management, and the various ethnic groups who lived in Homestead. Recently arrived immigrants from Slovakia, Poland, Russia, Hungary, Lithuania, and other countries accounted for more than half of the mill's 6,700 workers at the time. While you might think they had strength in numbers, there had to be times when my great-grandfather and his fellow Slavs felt like strangers in a strange land. The book describes it this way. Let me read you a short passage. The break between the Slavs and the rest of the community is on the whole more absolute than that between the whites and the Negroes. Think about that for a second. You know about the long tortured history we have in this country involving race. She is saying that the Slavs and the rest of the community had a bigger break between them than the whites and the blacks did in this area. She says, neither in lodge nor in church, nor in school do the two mingle. Even their living places are separated. The second ward, except for those who owned homes there in earlier years, has been largely abandoned to the newer immigrants. This sharp division, while partly due to the barrier which differences in language and custom create, is intensified by a feeling of scorn for the newcomers on the part of the older residents. They are, quote, hunkies, that is all, and many an American workman who earns but a few cents a day more looks upon them with an utter absence of kinship. Nevertheless, these Eastern Europeans face the same dangers and toil as anyone who was a worker inside the mill. No matter who you were or where you were born, this was your workplace. Byington says, the conditions under which the work is carried on seem to an outsider fairly intolerable. The din in the great vaulted sheds makes speech hard. Men who have worked near the engines, though their organs of hearing remain in good condition, sometimes become almost oblivious to ordinary sound. Some work where the heat is intense, and before the open doors of furnaces full of white-hot metal, they must wear smoked glasses to temper the glare. For the men directing the processes, the physical exertion is often not great, but most of the laborers perform heavy manual toil. And everywhere is the danger of accident from constantly moving machinery, from bars of glowing steel, from engines moving along the tracks in the yard. The men, of course, grow used to these dangers, but a new peril lies in the carelessness that results from such familiarity, for human nature cannot be eternally on guard. When I was a young reporter at the Beaver County Times, I remember spending a day at the Jones and Laughlin steel plant in Aliquippa. I don't know if any of you ever worked there, had business with them, but you surely might remember that plant. It stretched for 7 miles along the Ohio River. It was massive. In the late 1970s, it was still going strong. Despite the far greater safety practices of that era, on the day that I visited, I was struck by the heat, the sparks, the constant movement of vehicles and metal, big things that could hurt you that you had to watch out for. It struck me as a place of constant danger. I can't imagine what mill work would have been like, in an era around 1910 or so. In Homestead, at the start of the 20th century, if you were an unskilled laborer, the conditions were even worse. The labor is the heaviest and roughest in the mill, handling steel billets and bars, loading trains, working in cinder pits. Labor that demands mostly strength, but demands that in large measure. The basic laborers work usually under the direction of an English-speaking foreman whose orders they often don't understand. Accidents are frequent, promotions are rare. Despite the dangers, many employees had to work 12-hour shifts. Some departments at Homestead required a 7-day work week because it was inefficient to shut the processes down. Byington said the base pay for the common laborer was about $12 a week, which today equates to about $314. Nearly 3/4 of the Slavic workers made the lowest wage because they came to the plant largely unskilled. But I said earlier that this book is not just about the work in the mill. It also sheds light on life at home. The author asked 90 families, a cross-section of different income and ethnic groups, to keep a careful record of their spending for at least 4 weeks. And she gathers a lot of those statistics in here. What she found is that the men were inclined to trust all financial matters to their wives. According to the author, quote, "It is the custom in Homestead for the workman to turn over his wages to his wife on payday and to ask no questions as to what it goes for." The author also said that a key part of a woman's sound financial management for her family was keeping her husband away from more than 50 nearby watering holes. There was one wife who was quoted in the book who thought that card playing was evil, but she decided to make an exception. She allowed card playing in her house because she felt it kept her husband at home and sober. With the Slavic families making the lowest wages, many of them resorted to taking in boarders or lodgers to get more income. Half of the households in which steel workers made that $12 a week had boarders, most of whom were co-workers from the old country. In 1910, Andy Monegas and his wife, my great-grandparents, had one boarder. The census record shows that the couple next door had 4. In 102 Slavic households with boarders, Byington reported that 62 of them had between 1 and 4 boarders, while the other 40 homes, believe it or not, had between 5 and 15 boarders living with a family. Needless to say, these modest houses were not designed to handle tenants. Byington said they were 2 stories tall with little space between them. The ground floor had 2 rooms, the kitchen, and what was called the front room, which served as a parlor. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, which for many families accommodated husband, wife, children, and whatever number of boarders the household had. Outside, the neighborhood was grim. Byington describes it this way. Turn up a side street and you pass uniform frame houses, closely built and dulled by the smoke. Below, on the flats behind the mill, are cluttered alleyways, unsightly and unsanitary, the dwelling place of the Slavic laborers. The trees are dwarfed and the foliage withered by the fumes. The air is gray, and only from the top of the hill above the smoke is the sky clear blue. She goes on further to say, the section where the Slavs live is in itself gloomy. The level ground in the second ward, cut off from the river by the mill and from the country by the steep hill behind, forms a pocket where the smoke settles heavily. It's no surprise then that Homestead had explosive rates of child mortality at this point. In Slavic families, 1 child out of every 3 died before age 2. Among the native whites and African Americans, it was 1 child out of every 5. While malnutrition, overcrowding, and lack of proper sanitation played a part, Byington quoted a priest who believed that the burden of taking on so many lodgers in a household also contributed to the high death rate. What the priest said is, not only is the mother too busy to give much time to her babies, but she also suffers from overwork during pregnancy and from lack of proper care afterward. Housework must be done, boarders must be fed, and most women work until the day of confinement. My great-grandfather and his wife knew the pain of losing a child. In 1911, their son John died at age 2 from diphtheria, an illness that's often spread by crowded or unsanitary conditions. A child's death is tragic enough. Other families lost their adult breadwinner. Drawing from newspaper accounts, Byington reported that 52 men were injured at the Homestead plant in the first 3 months of March 1907. She says, 52 men were injured during that period at the Homestead mill, and 13 others who lived in Homestead at the time of the accidents were injured in other mills of the U.S. Steel Corporation outside of Homestead. Of this total of 65, 7 died. Of the remaining 58, 30, or a little over half, suffered such injuries as crushed feet, lacerated hands, sprained ankles, injuries for the most part that laid them up for at least a week or 2. But there were more serious accidents. 3 men had a leg or an arm broken, 2 had an arm amputated, 10 were wounded about the face and head, the eyes of 4 were hurt, 8 received internal injuries, and 1 was paralyzed. When my great-grandfather, Andy Monegas, died in 1913 at age 34, and after only 15 years in this country, it was not from a horrible mill accident, but meningitis. His widow decided to pack up her 5-year-old daughter and return to Slovakia. The mother also was pregnant with her next child, Jan, who would be born 7 months after his father died. Baby Jan was a true Slovak, but his sister Anna, my grandmother, was US born and therefore an American citizen. She could have stayed in Slovakia, but as she became a young woman, an uncle who worked in Homestead and traveled back and forth to Slovakia encouraged her and convinced her to return to America, where he felt she would have a better life. In 1929, at the age of 21, my grandmother, like her father 3 decades earlier, left for the United States and returned to Homestead. It goes without saying that that decision had tremendous consequences for me. 26 years later, I was the firstborn child of her firstborn child. I was the son, grandson, and great-grandson of Pittsburgh steel workers. While most readers of this book won't have the same personal connection as I do to the households of this mill town, they hardly need one. Byington's vivid portrayal of Homestead's early steelworkers provided a unique window on immigrant life in America. At this point, I thank you and would be happy to take questions. Yes, sir.
When you talked about the families that had boarders,
Yes.
when we went to college, I went with a fellow from Aliquippa that worked in the steel mills, and we went to college at nights. The most difficult thing he had to deal with in his life was his father was from Serbia, and they had a boarder. The boarder was an alcoholic. He would go and drink all week, and when he got his pay, he had to go to the bar and give him his pay. Well, when he got sick, he ended up taking him to the county hospital. So on the way back, my friend's father said to him, "How much does he have to pay?" He said, "Todd, he doesn't have to pay anything because he don't have any money." So the old man said to my buddy, "Well, Joe, how about if I have to go there? How much do I have to pay?" "You have to pay." "Why?" "I work for my money and save my money. He drank all his money. He goes free and I have to pay." Could not justify that with him. And that was a real problem. And if you think about it, it's kind of how we develop sometime back end on the front end, where that way he couldn't, in Europe, that would never happen. And he had an awful lot of problems with that.
Hi. My father worked most of his adult life at Crucible Steel, which was in Lawrenceville. And he worked on the open hearth furnace, as you described. And he said that picture of Joe Magarac they show stripped to the waist, he said, that's full of crap. He said, it is so hot there, that's going to burn your skin. They were layered with clothing to protect their skin. Also, they had wooden soles on their shoes because the floor got so hot it would burn their feet if they just had leather soles. Now, when the union came in, my father became what's called a grievance man. If a worker was charged with some offense and potentially being fired, they could file a grievance with the company and they would go before a neutral judge and plead their case. So my father could speak Polish fluently, and he had a worker, and he told me in private, the guy deserved to be fired for what he did, but he could hardly speak any English at all. So my father told him, look, I'm going to tell the judge what I want to tell him, but I'm going to ask you in Polish, and what I want you to respond is by saying the Our Father in Polish. So that went on for a while. Everything was good, but then eventually the attorneys for the company raised an objection. They said, Your Honor, Mr. Ruzicki, we object to the way Mr. Ruzicki is presenting this case, blah, blah, blah. And my dad said, Your Honor, if learned counsel would rather translate than me, that would be perfectly fine. The judge said, no, Mr. Ruzicki, you're doing a fine job. So my dad said to the laborer in Polish, they're catching on to us. You better switch to the Hail Mary. And it worked. He saved the guy's job.
That's a good story. I might want to talk to you later because my Polish grandmother's maiden name was Ruzicki. We could be cousins.
What role did religion play? The churches in many of these mill towns was sort of the center of activities outside the mill.
The churches played a huge role, and a few chapters of the book go into that. A lot of these immigrant workers built churches. They came, they arrived, they were mainly Roman Catholics, some were Orthodox, some were Greek Catholics, and a lot of those churches didn't exist, but the mill workers wanted places where they could get married. They felt they had to be in church on a Sunday. And so some of those churches were created by these mill communities. Some of them existed and were made stronger. And the churches provided a great source of support. And they also became a magnet, as you might imagine, for a lot of these workers, and that was one way for the men to meet eligible young women. And so a lot of families resulted from associations that happened in those churches.
Hey, Tom, was there kind of a pipeline from Western Pennsylvania back to Slovakia and those countries about the jobs and the opportunities? I mean, how did people there find out about what was going on here?
A lot of the American industrial companies recruited people. They sent folks over to Poland and Slovakia and Russia and told them that jobs were available. And sometimes maybe they painted a picture that was a little too rosy, but on the whole, there was opportunity that those people had here that they would have not gotten back, would not have gotten back home. And so the other thing that was the pipeline were family members. You would see an elder brother come over, and he'd be here for 6 months or a year and do fairly well, and then the younger brothers would come, cousins would come, they would board in their houses, they would help them get set up, and so the families themselves became a pretty strong pipeline.
When they recruited, would the companies pay passage for these people to come, or was it on
I'm not
them?
aware of that. I don't think so. I think they just did a lot of promotion and publicity of the jobs and showed people how to get here and where to land, really.
They actually lent them the money for the passage, and then they had to pay it back.
Oh, really? Is that a fact? Okay.
At least some that I heard about.
Uh-huh.
Yes, I worked for LTV and J&L. And the old timers down there would tell us stories about when payday was, they got paid by cash. And all the wives would be outside the gate waiting for them to grab that money envelope. And what the kids would do is go down at the same time and start picking up pay envelopes, because people would just take the bills out and leave the change. And they'd always come up with a few pennies here and there. And I learned a lot from them people in the old timers.
Everybody scored big on payday, huh?
Do you have books for sale with you?
I don't, unfortunately, but you can find it on Amazon. You could find it at the Penguin Bookshop here in Sewickley. I know it's there. And this is the printing that you'll find on the stands right now.
Is that for sale?
No, this is my only copy, sorry. In the back.
To expand on what he said about the paydays, the cash paydays, my father worked in J&L right after World War II, and he always said about the money being paid in cash, and he got so bad, especially down in downtown Aliquippa and Ambridge, the guys would get paid in cash, and the first place they'd go to the bars, and they'd blow all their money, and the wives pressured the companies that they wanted their husbands paid by check, okay? And that's the reason like J&L went to check, because they were tired of listening to all the mothers bitching about it. Now, how the bar owners got around it is the guy would come in with his check and they would cash his check right at the bar, and he'd spend money at the bar. That's why, like he said, a lot of the wives, they stuck around because not only did they get paid in check, but they figured out how to cash it. The bars would cash those checks for them.
It's a great story. Yes, sir.
Can you discuss a little bit about genealogy and the steps of genealogy?
Talk about the steps of genealogy.
How do you pursue it?
Well,
I came from a relatively small family, and there just isn't anybody around.
okay. Well, there are various genealogical websites. Ancestry.com is the one that a lot of people know. And so if you have computer access, you become a member, you pay for a certain level of membership, and it is amazing. The records that I used to have to track down on paper and in different offices, say 15, 20 years ago, exist now at your fingertips through your computer. And so even if you have a small family, you start out with the people you know, and you build your family tree. You put in your parents, you put in, your spouse, your kids, and anybody you know, and you start sketching out this family tree. And so a program like Ancestry will then send you hints. They call them hints. And they'll say, well, we've got an Andras Monegas who supposedly died in Homestead in 1913. Is this your relative? And it'll put this in front of your face, and you'll be able to decide or figure out, yeah, that's my great-grandfather, or it's not. And so things come to you without you having to search. You also do a lot of searching yourself. You use a search box, you put in a name, it'll ask you for a birth date, a marriage date, anything you know about them, a location. Where did they live for part of their life? And a program like Ancestry.com will then do the searching for you in its amazingly huge archive of records. There is also a website put out by the Mormon Church. You don't have to be a Mormon. It is free to the public, and it's called Family Search. It does a similar thing. You log in there and you set up your own family tree, and for nothing, they will send records your way that you can take a look at and say, is that a relative in my family? And you begin making these connections, and your tree gets bigger and bigger. So if you're just thinking about starting out, that's something you might consider. Libraries make computer terminals available to people who don't have them at home. There are a lot of ways to get after this information.
One of the places I think that it would give you a lot of information is Ellis Island, where almost all of the foreigners process through Ellis Island.
Right.
I had an Italian physician years and years ago that show you what some of these people had to go through. He said when he got off the boat and went through Ellis Island, he started walking down a street in New York, and he saw a sign that said hot dogs. And he said, damn, I couldn't figure out what the hell that was. He said, I walked away thinking that was a breeding place for animals.
But Ellis Island is also online. You can do ellisisland.org, and you can go to their immigration records without having to go to New York.
You know, Swickley is a good example of that. You know how many people, Italian people in Swickley, came from the same mountain town in southern Italy?
Really?
Chitzania. Yeah.
Right.
They'd come here, get a job, and then they'd break home or call home, and hell, everybody else came.
Right, they create that pipeline,
Yeah.
bringing the relatives over.
Yeah, my grandparents and family, actually associated industry. They were in the coal mines down in Fayette County. And I can remember, it's still there, my mother lived in Phillips, where they had their company houses and duplexes in a row. And my father lived in New Salem, kind of off in a separate little house. And I never knew him. He had passed away from congestive heart failure, but apparently he had gotten involved in some union organizing, so they threw him and his family out of their house. And they ended up in, people would just take them in and take care of them. And my aunt had a picture of the room. There was a kitchen and a front room. And in the kitchen, there was a big bowl in the middle of the floor, and all the kids were around the bowl eating. And and I always wonder when I see a name Sanko, how somebody got that name, because it was made up. My grandfather was Stanislaw Chaika, and it was the company store that changed that to Steve Sanko. So I had one uncle who kept that, and I have an aunt who's still, the last aunt today, she says, well, as long as she was in the Polish school, she was Chaika, but once she got out of the Polish school, she became Sanko. And there, a lot of, in those communities, everything revolved around the company store. And they're still there. I mean, there's buildings, the old buildings are still there. And where at one point I lived on a street called Millview Street in Uniontown, and then later in New Salem when my father went to Korea. And when you went to New Salem, from Uniontown to New Salem, you had to pass by the coke ovens. And they had this little wooden fence that kept all the crap from, you have to turn your lights on and see where you're going. And it's just amazing that, and all those people back, everybody took care of each other. And there was no welfare, there was no nothing, but if you needed help, people came together. And still, what I remember in Uniontown, there's a Polish funeral home, there's an Italian funeral, everybody had their own community funeral home.
Like the churches, yeah.
Yeah, just like the churches.
You're mentioning the coal mining in your family. That's my father's side, the Waseleskis, and there's the most confounding thing right now that it's a brick wall that I've not been able to break in terms of genealogical research. The passenger manifest, you know what that is? You're on a ship, it's got a whole list of all the passengers. And from that era, like the late 1800s, early 1900s, the manifest would say, where are you coming from? Who was your nearest relative that you were with in the old country? And where are you bound? Where are you moving? And who is your nearest contact there? And so my grandfather, Andrew Waseleski, came here. I've got his passenger manifest that said he was going to Elizabeth and he was going to meet his brother Joseph, who now lives here. And I then saw a passenger manifest for his sister Anna and sister Maria. Anna, I remember from my childhood. We visited her. Maria came at the same time as Anna, and they said, we're coming to our brother Joseph in Elizabeth. I have not found Joseph anywhere, you know, in a manifest, in a census report. I have not found Maria anywhere. Again, they're like ghosts. They're mentioned in a record. They evidently had some connection to my family, but I have been able to find no other records saying where they lived, where they worked, did they marry anybody, and that's the thrill and the agony of genealogy. You know, you keep looking.
Another question. These mill towns, were the bosses typically Protestants, and did that create problems because they were probably Anglo-Saxons? You know, I know a close friend of mine, they were Germanic heritage, and they seem to have done better in They grew up in Homestead. They seem to have done better than, let's say, the Slavs did.
I'm not a researcher. I can't say for sure, and some of you may have your own experiences in these industries. I would say, based on my reading, that's probably true. They were English-speaking, fairly, you know, well-educated white people of the community, and they became the bosses. I mean, it makes a certain amount of sense, and they can't be expected to know Slovak, Russian, all the languages that you would be dealing with among your laborers. Yes?
With regard to the German population, that was much earlier. In
Yes.
fact, when the state of Pennsylvania legislature was trying to decide on a language, English won by only 2 votes over German.
Oh, really?
There were so many Germans all over the United States,
Wow.
especially in Pennsylvania. You know it because so many towns have German towns.
Right, right.
That's Philadelphia.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, does this conversation hit home? My father, ancestry is from Croatia. Okay, when his father came over, my father was working in the steel mills in a blast furnace, and then the war broke out. Second World War breaks out. He ends up going to the Marine Corps, Guadalcanal. After that, he came back and got married. Went back into the mill. He was there for a day or two. He said, I can't do this anymore. It was, you know, he just could not take the heat from the blast furnace.
Sure.
So what, you know, then one of his friends told him about, you know, look, you qualify for the GI Bill. He said, why don't you go to college? He said, I'm going to University of Pittsburgh. That's where my father ends up going to University of Pittsburgh. He becomes a school teacher and loved it. And that's so many people from our backgrounds, that's what they did.
Right. Well, he learned from his short experience of the mill that he didn't want to be there.
Exactly. He couldn't do it.
Yeah.
He could not work in that heat.
I was going to say, on the ships, whenever they came over, like you were looking at the manifest, okay, one of the things that happened was if you could pay for anything above portage, then you could get off in New York City. But if you were a portage, then you had to go to Ellis Island. Okay, so that would be where depends on how your fare was. Well, when you went to Ellis Island.
I didn't know that there were different disembarkation points.
Yes, there
Yeah.
was.
Oh, that's
They would
interesting.
do, so that's one of the things that people have to realize. And a lot of times, let's face it, if the people were poorer or they had to borrow the money, then that's probably where they ended up going, you know, and then they would be examined, everything.
Right.
They may have been shipped back at times.
Some were,
Okay,
yeah.
but if you could get off in New York City at just walk down the street and go get a train to wherever you wanted to go, you know.
Interestingly enough, I was in the scrap business, and we participated in the demolition of the U.S. Steel Homestead Works, and we were moving about 8,000 tons of structural steel and other steel from that mill down to Nucor, which is an electric furnace mill and now the largest steel company in the United States. So there was a cannibalization of Homestead, and it was moved down to Nucor. And if you guys ever go down to Aquature Stadium, if you look at the I-beams in that stadium, they were all produced at the Nucor plant where the Homestead mill steel went to.
Interesting.
Yeah, another interesting point, I'm not sure whether U.S. Steel still owns this operation, but about 15 or 20 years ago, or maybe a little longer than that, U.S. Steel actually bought a large steel company in Eastern Europe, and it was significant in production and meant a lot to their bottom line. I'm not quite sure whether they still own it, but I think it was in the
in Slovakia.
Slovakia, yeah.
Košice,
yeah, right.
Yes,
right.
I've seen that plant because I visited relatives in Slovakia
Oh,
several
really?
years ago.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. Was it close to the your family?
Yes, it was, and it looked like a big sprawling steel plant like you would see here in the 1980s. I mean,
Right.
It covered a lot of acreage, a lot of smoke, but it employed an awful lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are two little interesting factoids. Any other questions?
My mother, she was Canadian. She came as a little girl to Ellis Island, and she had to wear a sign around her neck with her name, you know, Penny, big written letters on it. And my uncle brought her here. He was Canadian, and her older sister. And they lived way out on Mattatuck, Long Island, in the farming business. And that's how they got their start. But when my father came here, he came during the war. He was a convoy from Halifax to Wales through the North Atlantic. My mother said he was in a lifeboat a lot of times. But he survived the war. And he met up with my mother at the Newfoundland Club or something down in Brooklyn, New York, and then they got married in November of 1941. They had to go to Montreal because my mother was the naturalized citizen. He wasn't. So they had to stay in Montreal with a family overnight named Lavers. I got their middle name. And after they got married, they came back, and he says, oh, thank God, no more war, because he was in with the Germans from 37 to 41. And here a month later, they bombed Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
But he was also a shipbuilder. He built boats, and he could, you know, sail by the stars at night and everything. And he worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard as an iron worker.
It's a great story.
This may come as an interesting fact. I'm not going to ask a question, just make a statement. You wonder how many ethnicities got nicknames, and specifically WAPs for Italian, and wonder how they got that nickname. Well, a lot of people came over from Italy, and they got to Ellis Island. They didn't have any papers concerning who they were and so forth. So they just put a big sign on them, WOP, without papers.
I hadn't heard that. And you know where the name hunky comes from. At the time, the Austria-Hungarian Empire covered so much area in Eastern Europe that, you know, when they were recording the immigrants coming in, didn't matter if you were Slovak, Serbian, Croatian, whatever, they just put down Hungarian. And so a lot of our ancestors who came from those countries weren't truly Hungarian. I mean, they were from those individual countries that were dominated by the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
My grandfather was actually Austrian.
Truly Austrian?
Yeah.
Okay.
At the time.
Yeah, yeah.
Became Polish later.